This is Talkin' Mule Deer with your hosts Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. Talkin' Mule Deer takes you on a journey to learn more about the Mule Deer Foundation, mule deer and black-tailed deer biology and management, tips and tactics for hunting, conservation issues, and even features some of our corporate and celebrity partners. Now, let's start talking mule deer.
All right, this is Jody Stemler.
And I'm Steve Belinda, and today we're talking with Jeff Crane of the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation here at the 2019 SHOT Show. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here with both of you.
Yeah, now Jeff and I actually go back quite a long ways because I used to be the Director of Communications of the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation when Jeff was the Director of Policy at Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation many years ago, and now as President.
So he worked up and you worked out.
That's it. Not necessarily in that order, though.
Well, I will say, and what we want to do is spend a little bit of time understanding what Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation is, but as a friend and as a colleague, what you have done with the organization over the last 13 years since I left. We were on an upward trajectory, but you have blown the roof off for the organization. So we are honored to have you here with us today, and thanks for all you do. So tell us, what is Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, and what is it you do? Why are you important?
So we're entering our 30th year, which is hard to imagine, Jody, and where the time goes. But so we were set up to work originally in Congress with like-minded members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, House members, Senate members, to identify opportunities in the policy arena to advance hunting, shooting, trapping, recreational shooting. And that's still the core mission, though we have expanded that into the states in the years while you were there for the first initial one in 2004, but originally we were set up to work inside of Washington with the United States Congress.
So the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation is an organization, but there is something called the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. Tell me a little bit about that.
So caucuses are basically, there are lots of caucuses in the Congress. I mean, there's literally 400 or 500 of them. Wine caucuses, cowboy boot caucuses, the Hispanic caucus, on and on and on. The Sportsmen's Caucus are folks that believe in sustainable use and conservation, and it has grown into the largest, most active bipartisan caucus on Capitol Hill. And we've got leadership in the House, leadership in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. Our view is that conservation and hunting and fishing is not defined by a political party, and it is more about educating those folks that don't know it, and we use the caucus to help do that.
So, and you mentioned the states. You, about 10 years ago, launched something called the National Assembly of Sportsmen's Caucuses, which follows a similar model in state legislatures. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And we started in 2004 with that idea, have now grown that to 48 of the 50 states, nearly 2,500 out of 7,200 state legislators, so it's actually a bigger functioning policy role than what the Sportsmen's Caucus is in Washington.
Okay, and you also have a governor's Sportsmen's Caucus as well.
Correct.
So obviously governorships. Basically what you're trying to accomplish is to try to provide the information to the legislative, to the elected bodies, the individuals who are making a difference or will in some capacity, either by voting on legislation or setting up any kind of policy through the governor's office, and make sure that they're listening to sportsmen's issues. They're caring about conservation and sportsmen's issues.
Correct. That's all we do. So that is, you nailed it. We work in the political arena at the state and the federal level. I've got staff that are spread all across the country, so geographically they can get to the state capitals and be around the legislators and the governor's offices. So we have a rapport and a trust that we're not going to steer somebody wrong. We're not going to play partisan politics, that this is truly about what's good for hunting and conservation and fishing and wildlife. And so that's exactly what we do.
Okay. So we are, the average sportsman might say, I don't care about politics. Never done anything good for me. But we have Miles Moretti.
I can kind of understand that based on what's going on in Washington right now.
Yeah, no kidding. But we have Miles Moretti here, president of Mule Deer Foundation, and you guys both find it obviously very important to work on policy-related initiatives. Between the two of you, explain why the average sportsman should care about policy.
Well, glad you let me join you with such a distinguished guest. And
He was late, by the way.
Yeah,
Thanks, Miles.
Yeah, I was late. Sorry, I was
Trying
down
to
on
navigate the shot show floor.
Shot show floor, but and then Butler stopped me. So,
Oh, there you go.
but anyhow, it's amazing how many issues that Congress and the federal government do, and the state legislatures that affect wildlife conservation, state wildlife management, appropriation to the federal agencies. I mean, these are all things that we work on, and they're really important programs.
And by appropriation, you mean providing federal funding, which, when the government shuts down is what they're not doing.
Right.
Correct.
But that's what an appropriation means.
Yeah, right now during the government shutdown, we can't do our habitat projects. We're stopped. We're kind of dead in the water right now until the government gets reopened, which is what we're in right now.
Okay. So give me an example of some of the policy that went down in the last Congress that you all were working on that would be relevant, that would be understandable to somebody in the field about what makes a difference.
So one of the biggest things, and it's really the private land side of things, is the Farm Bill. It gets authorized every 5 years. There's a great big conservation title. It's a lot of incentive programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, the environmental, the EQIP. I can't even think of all the acronyms.
Incentives Program.
Washington is great with
acronyms. We love letters.
That nobody understands, but there's a lot of private land programs. So the Farm Bill, we were able to work with Congress to negotiate our way through that. So that was really an important thing. Now it's incumbent on us to work with the new Congress to make sure they're implementing things correctly. So.
And Miles, that Farm Bill actually had something pretty important for mule deer conservation and sagebrush conservation. Tell us a little bit about that.
A bill that we've been working on for about 3 years, which was sponsored by Senator Hatch of Utah and Senator Heinrich of New Mexico. It was called the Sagebrush
Sage grouse and mule
Sage
deer.
Grouse Mule Deer Enhancement Act. And so what it does is help speeds up the bureaucracy for us to do projects on the ground. And it was a really great bipartisan bill. It had a lot of support and passed the Senate almost unanimously and was only caught up in kind of the end of Congress. So they put it in the Farm Bill, and it's going to really help mule deer out west.
So basically what that did was it created an opportunity of something called a categorical exclusion, allowing for habitat restoration projects. So a lot of the stuff that you, Steve, are working on, and Mule Deer Foundation in general, on for big habitat projects that benefit grouse, sagebrush, mule deer habitat.
So we took what folks, practitioners are out there doing now and being successful at, and looking at the hardship that comes with getting a project approved on federal ground. And a lot of that is the National Environmental Policy Act, procedures and documents, the clearances for cultural resources, and the Endangered Species Act issues that you sometimes create bottlenecks, and says, okay, where can we do things out on the landscape that are good for these two species that don't violate any laws, that basically it's a bureaucratic administrative issue, and how can we speed that up? And the way you do that is through either tiering to a completed environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, or doing what they call a categorical exclusion, which gets vetted by an agency and the Council of Environmental Quality to say that project in and of itself is not having an impact detrimental to the environment. So therefore, categorically, we're going to allow this to move forward so that good things can happen. And progress isn't slowed, and projects aren't slowed because of either lack of resources or just so many projects hitting the pipeline.
So as an example, fire goes through an area. To be able to replant vegetation back in there, bitterbrush, sagebrush, other grasses and forbs, in the past, you might have to do a NEPA type of a document, an environmental assessment, to be able to go in there and do the project. In the meantime, all the weeds move into that burned area. You've lost soil because it's now started to run off because you're revegetating. You haven't been able to revegetate, right? So this will allow you to rapidly go into a place like that, a burned out area, and be able to revegetate, to improve the habitat. without having to go through some of that bureaucratic paperwork.
Simply, I call it'll enable us to improve mule deer habitat, create healthy rangelands that benefits all wildlife and even the livestock producers there on public land. And so it really is a win-win for a lot of wildlife species and a lot of local communities.
Yeah, a lot of folks that are against the use of categorical exclusions don't understand there's still a screening process. There's
Right.
still planning at the local level. There's still an administrative officer, a decision maker that has to sign off on that project. All this is doing is saying there are folks out there that want to help. We know we have a massive projects ahead of us in both juniper and fire rehab. Let's work to get it done quicker, and let's maybe reduce that burden on us. And so it hopefully will allow the Mule Deer Foundation and groups like it to get more money on the ground, and there more project work done and better habitat conditions for the species that are out there.
Good.
And I think another thing that really passed, and Jeff, I'd like you to talk about this, is the fire funding fix.
Right.
That's huge for us in the West. And that's something that I think is really important.
So tell us what that is.
So obviously we went through another terrible year, in particular California, with just catastrophic fires. So the way that things, very simplistically put, the way things are working now, in particular with the Forest Service, when they run out of money to treat and to manage fires once they've started, they have to borrow money, which basically is robbing Peter to pay Paul, because you're
Right.
taking away from the core mission of trying to do good management on the forest, because all you're doing is fighting catastrophic fires. And so we worked with Congress and were successful in passing some language that helps with that fire borrowing to create a fix for that, where it's treated like disaster relief funding. And so it's not necessarily stealing all the money from one aspect of the Forest Service just for that one component. And hopefully that'll allow the Forest Service to be able to spend more time doing good management work on the
Right.
forest rangelands.
So another aspect of your guys' position, being leaders in the conservation world and in the policy world, is you're both on the Hunting and Shooting Sport Conservation Council. Did I get that right?
You did.
And that is a federal advisory committee act chartered group that can give formal advice to the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture. Tell us a little bit about that group and what are the topics and priorities that you guys are dealing with.
Well, Jeff's the chairman, so I'll let him go first.
Okay, so it was, as you said, it's a federal advisory committee. It was appointed by the secretaries with a charter that tells us what we're supposed to be focusing on, which is really primarily federal public lands. But since Department of Ag manages the Farm Bill programs, it includes that in the Forest Service. But we immediately, organizationally, I think there's 14 or so of us, something like that, organizationally started creating some committees to try to break down the various charges: hunting, shooting sports, conservation, and then a communications component. And then what we do, Steve, is basically develop as a group specific recommendations to the various secretaries, asking that the government looks at this as, a possibility to move forward. And we put out 9 recommendations in our last meeting, everything from the potential of using more qualified volunteers to handle ungulate overmanagement in the Park Service, to CWD, more comprehensive CWD to handling some of the guzzlers and the issues with water in some of those areas on federal public lands, primarily in the Southwest. And Miles, you want to add to that?
And yeah, I'm the chairman of the Wildlife Conservation Committee, and even though I'm on some other committees, and the first real big issue we took on was CWD. It's really raising its ugly head across the West and in the East now, and encouraging more research dollars, more funding for monitoring, so the state wildlife agencies can kind of track that. Hunter access is a big thing, opening up the federal refuges and opening up those federal lands that are either, for some reason, have a regulation from keeping them open, making things simpler. And so those are some of the support recommendations we're moving up, and as we go forward, there's some other new recommendations coming down that'll help management on especially on BLM lands.
And so you guys are so knowing a little bit about this, probably too much to be dangerous. you work on things like secretarial orders, the ones that we've seen come out, to give advice on how they can better implement them at the agency level and how well they're doing out to those of us that are experiencing them on the ground. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and one of our subcommittees under wildlife conservation is migration corridors,
Right.
and we're going to look at ways that we can help supplement, make recommendations to the secretary to help complement that secretarial order, and ways that the agency, sometimes it's hard to get from a secretarial order down to the ground. And as you know, as being an old person on the BLM person on the ground, sometimes what happens in Washington, D.C. may not actually transpire down to the ground. But and I think that's a good place that we can help. We can find those issues where bottlenecks are occurring in the system.
Yeah, so and for those listeners out there who aren't familiar with this is the third iteration of a committee like this. So it has been bipartisan. Both
Yes.
the Bush George W. Bush and President Obama and now President Trump have all seen the value of having this to advise the secretaries.
Correct.
Yeah. And so I think that's a good example of, Jeff, something you mentioned earlier, is you have to be political in this business, but not be partisan.
Right.
And so, Karen, being able to, represent all the views of sportsmen out there is pretty important.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, when we first meet and getting ready to get in a duck line, says, hey, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? No, that doesn't happen, And so these issues transcend that side of things. But understanding the political playing field, if you will, is where our organization specifically, because we're based right in Washington, D.C., we do this work full time. I think just gives us a bit of an advantage just in terms of our background and our location.
So what do you guys, reading the political tea leaves that are albeit a little bit murky as we're right now just fighting over whether or not we can open the government back up again, particularly a lot of our land management agencies. But in the next few months, moving in, this is a brand new Congress. What do you guys see as being some of the big issues that you'll be working on either in the near term or building momentum across the course of these next few years?
Miles, if you're good, I'll start with that. So right out of the blocks, Senator Murkowski from Alaska reintroduced a public lands package that was really fairly close to getting agreement at the end of the last Congress, and then partisan politics collapsed the whole end of the last Congress because they're not even able to open the government back up again. So she's reintroduced that. We're working with her. There's a number of our access provisions in that piece of legislation. There's Farm Bill implementation stuff that needs to be really just monitored and supervised. The land and water conservation funding and the opportunity to permanently authorize that and direct some of that money for these access only for hunting and fishing access would be a gigantic thing. And then, of course, another giant initiative is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which came out of a blue ribbon panel, and that's trying to direct money back through the states off of oil and gas revenues primarily on federal public lands to get out in front of species of greatest concern, because we've got a looming crisis in terms of how many candidate species could be out there under the Endangered Species Act. And just looking at the sage grouse and the amount of money that had to go into one species, there's something like 12,000 candidate species out there, and you can only imagine that this is a perfect storm if we don't get out in front of it.
And that would provide billions of dollars, correct?
Billions, yeah, 1.3 billion a year, and so I mean that's real money even in Washington speak. But we're really arguing hard, and we had a really good bipartisan run in the House and got a bill introduced in the Senate, but a really good bipartisan run in that bill in the 115th Congress, which just ended in 2018. Unfortunately, it didn't get all the way there, and if you're nothing else when you work in Washington, you got to be patient and just be persistent, because stuff doesn't happen easily in most cases in getting legislation passed.
Now, is there a Sportsman's Act as well? I know that's been something people have followed. And there are a couple of different types of funding programs and authorization programs. Is that right? Tell me a little bit about.
Yeah,
I know you guys have worked in the past.
And we thought going back to, I don't know, 8 years ago, that this would be a good idea to kind of collectively put together a package and call it the Sportsmen's Act. And each Congress, because Congress lasts 2 years, so 4 Congresses in a row, we've come up short. And so last year we told ourselves, man, we're not doing this again. And, you know, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But we had some of our members of our caucus, some members of Congress that were really interested in pushing this, and they dropped various versions of the bill. Right now, again, Senator Murkowski's got some of those provisions. Jody, I personally, and just for my own, I don't want to do this again. This is an enormous amount of energy and time, and I've seen how this play ends.
Yeah.
So I don't want to do it again.
Find a new way around.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Miles, what are some issues in the West, some either state or federal, that you see coming up?
Well, I think implementation of this fire fix and see how that affects us this next year. And then also working with the appropriators for budget to make sure that we can get BLM and the Forest Service the funding they need to create these healthy rangelands and these healthy forests. And I think that's key. That's a big issue that's a tough one. And, you know, it's a tough fight because there's a lot of funding requests that everybody has. But I think having those be implemented on the ground in the next couple of years are going to be huge. And one of the things about the fire fix earlier was when those big fires happen, everything gets shut down. They take that money away, and so the projects that we have, the local contractors that we have working out in the field, they get shut down. And even though they're not in a fire area, they don't have Forest Service or BLM personnel to monitor the project. So that's I think going to help us a lot out there. And I'm relying on Jeff and those back in D.C. to do a lot of heavy lifting on some of the LWCF and some of the other programs. We won't be maybe as heavily involved there. We'll support, but I see really implementation of these programs and these secretarial orders. Of course, kind of institutionalizing migration corridors. There is a bill that's a national corridors bill that has some problems with it. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can be effective in either, modifying that bill or making that bill something that we can work with out in the West. But as it's written right now, it's got some real issues.
Well, thank you guys for your time here. We have, every time we put out our magazine, we have an article written by the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation that provides a little bit of information about the issues that are going on right now. If they want to get more information or to stay on top of this, where could they go?
Obviously, we've got a web page. It's a long one. It's congressionalsportsmen.org.
That's men, M-E-N, right?
sportsmen.org. And please, we've got weekly electronic news things that go out. But, yeah, we're happy to have people subscribe. We've got social media and everything that you would expect.
And congressionalsportsmen.org will also get you information to the state caucuses as well.
Correct.
So you can get information not just about what's going on in Congress and how you might have an impact, but also what's going on in your state legislatures, because there are very specific things that can impact your hunting and fishing in the state legislatures. And Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and their it's a spin-off organization, but it's all the same staff with the National Assembly of Sportsmen's Caucuses is a tremendous resource to get that information.
Right. So we're following on average 5,000 bills a week when they're in session. So you want to find out about something, we probably have something that we can tell you about what's going on.
And the North Carolina just recently had a constitutional amendment to guarantee you right to hunt and fish. Those are the types of things that the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and state sportsmen's caucuses are doing. So just as an example.
So, Jeff, let me ask you this before we leave. I hear all the time, sportsmen at the local level don't get involved because it doesn't make a difference. How do you respond to that?
I hear it all the time, too, and I think that our numbers in terms of declining numbers are indicative that you better be involved or you're going to let it slip away for a lot of reasons. But, yeah, we need you to be involved. Show up to your chapters in the Mule Deer Foundation. Go to local meetings and whatnot. be involved. You don't have to be an expert in policy or politics to understand that there are issues there. Your voice has to be made heard, or otherwise we're going to get rolled over.
Even just picking up the phone and calling your congressman or your senator's office and saying, I want you to vote yay or nay, makes a difference.
It does. And
I'm a
you
mule
can find
deer
it.
hunter,
You
and
can,
I want you to
right.
support this.
And you can find information on our websites and a lot of the other sporting conservation groups' websites. It'll tell you how to write it. You don't have to be the policy expert on it. You just got to know that, hey, if this happens, we are going to be adversely impacted, and therefore we want you to do X. Simple.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. We, as always, thank you for what you do, Jeff. I think you have one of the hardest jobs in conservation, but probably one of the most rewarding jobs in conservation when you see stuff come through that helps sportsmen and conservation. And so we're happy you took some time out of your SHOT Show schedule to talk to us, and we really look forward to working with both of you in the future.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jody.
Till the next time, this is Jody Stemler.
And I'm Steve Belinda, and thank you for talking mule deer.
Since we talked to Jeff and Miles at SHOT Show, Congress passed S-47, the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act, and President Trump signed it into law on March 12th. This legislation that Jeff mentioned reauthorizes the Land and Water Conservation Fund and includes specific sportsman's access provisions. The legislation also includes numerous public lands and waters conservation, including protection of the Methow headwaters in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, which is home to Washington State's largest mule deer herd. Thanks for talking mule deer with Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. The Mule Deer Foundation is the only conservation group in North America dedicated to restoring, improving, and protecting mule deer and black-tailed deer and their habitat. MDF is a strong voice for hunters in access, wildlife management, and conservation policy issues. To find out more, visit www.muledeer.org and stay tuned for the next episode of Talkin' Mule Deer.